books on the 1864 Valley campaign. We're going to have a book signing. He's got 3 books here: The Shenandoah Summer, George Washington and the French and Indian War, and then Worthy of a Higher Rank. We have a few copies of that, which is General Colburn, who was active twice on this battlefield. So without further ado, Scott, let us know what you need to.
So, welcome to Kernstown. I always want to start off here to give everybody, how many of you is the first time you've been here? A lot, okay. So, I'd like to start off with to put everything in perspective. First of all, the Shenandoah Valley in the Civil War. From 1861 through 1864, the Shenandoah Valley was a place where actions impacted the primary theaters of war between the main Union and Confederate armies east of the Blue Ridge. In 1861, when the two armies were about to were squaring off before the Manassas campaign in July, actions out here in the Shenandoah Valley by Joe Johnston and the Union forces to the north, it kind of just developed into a stalemate, and the Union forces withdrew north of the Potomac River and kind of went dormant. That allowed the Confederate forces in the northern Shenandoah Valley to take the Manassas Gap Railroad over to Manassas Junction. And amongst the troops that Joe Johnston brought to Manassas with him was Stonewall Jackson, commander of the Stonewall Brigade. And his presence on the battlefield at Henry Hill turned the tide of battle into favor of the Confederacy, where they earned a victory. In 1862, the Union had assembled a large force on the Virginia Peninsula, south and east of Richmond, under George McClellan. He moved slow, but he was moving steadily with overwhelming force towards Richmond. Stonewall Jackson launches a brilliant campaign in 1862 spring out here in the Shenandoah Valley, and troops that were earmarked for that campaign to join McClellan start being sent out here to the Shenandoah Valley. What happens? McClellan feels he does not have the numerical advantage that was necessary to undertake offensive operations. Robert E. Lee takes command and launches counterattacks, and McClellan withdraws down the peninsula. So once again, Jackson's actions in 1862 proved pivotal. In 1863, the Union garrison here in Winchester under General Robert Milroy stood in the way of Robert E. Lee's planned invasion of Pennsylvania. And before he could undertake this, he had to clear the way. And Dick Ewell's Second Army Corps, Jackson's old command, routs Milroy at the Second Battle of Winchester in mid-June of 1863. So you see this trend here developing with the Shenandoah Valley's operations impacting directly what's happening between the two main Union and Confederate armies in the Eastern Theater. In 1864, the intensity of the combat out here in the Shenandoah Valley, like throughout the several theaters of war, is going to be ramped up, because Ulysses S. Grant has recognized that throughout the war, Union would have success in one area and then they would go dormant and not follow up. Confederates would reinforce another area and achieve a victory. This had been most recently highlighted on a major significant means is that post-Gettysburg, General James Longstreet's corps from the Army of Northern Virginia is going to be shifted down to Tennessee to reinforce General Braxton Bragg. Prior to this, the Union Army down there under General William Rosecrans was moving into North Georgia, and it looked like they were going to be very successful. But these reinforcements from Longstreet allowed them to launch the South to launch devastating counterattacks at the Battle of Chickamauga that September, and so it sets back Union plans there. So Grant's plans in 1864 are designed to prevent this. In Georgia, he's going to have William Sherman in command, and he's going to have him moving towards Atlanta against Joe Johnston and the Army of Tennessee. In Virginia, his main action is going to be George Meade's Army of the Potomac against Robert E. Lee in the Overland Campaign, moving south from the Rappahannock, going over the Rapidan River, and just continuous combat until they got to Richmond. Down in the south side of Virginia, another Union army under James Butler would be moving up the James River against General Beauregard's force. In the Shenandoah Valley, Grant has a two-pronged attack plan that spring. He's going to have Franz Sigel moving south out of Martinsburg and Winchester. George Crook is going to march out of the mountains of West Virginia, deep into southwest Virginia, to raid salt mines and lead mines and tear up the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad, which was vital for bringing supplies up from southwest Virginia and troops from Tennessee. It went all the way to Lynchburg, then on to a little town south of Richmond called Petersburg. So Grant's campaign in 1864 out here was designed to go at these Confederate resources. Things are going to go bad for Grant from the south. Franz Sigel fails, and he's going to be routed by John Breckinridge because of Sigel's poor piecemeal tactics, largely at the Battle of Newmarket. Crook would win his battle in early May in southwest Virginia, but the Confederates would keep him from ranging too far, and he doesn't get any word from Sigel. The two were supposed to meet somewhere in between, around Stanton, and then move over to east of the Blue Ridge. So Crook withdraws into the mountains of West Virginia. Well, Grant, one thing he's determined, and he quickly appoints a new commander, General David Hunter, to take over the Union forces, and they will win a victory on June the 5th at the Battle of Piedmont, Virginia. And this will open the door to Stanton. And so the Union troops there, they'll be destroying mills, railroads, and other industrial resources that were supplied the Confederacy. George Crook would cross back over the mountains and join Hunter at Stanton. And on June 10th, they're going to start heading south towards Lynchburg. They'll reach Lynchburg on the 17th of June. And Lynchburg is a vital railroad and supply center. As I mentioned earlier, the railroad's coming up from Tennessee and southwest Virginia, bringing reinforcements and supplies. The railroad north out of there, the Orange and Alexandria, went up to Charlottesville, Gordonsville, and Culpeper. It also intersected with the Virginia Central Railroad, which was going through the Blue Ridge and on to the Richmond area. So Lynchburg was also a vital supply and hospital center, because by the time June rolls around, the fighting is going to be shifting down in the Richmond area, and then subsequently Richmond and Petersburg to the south. But Grant getting Hunter to Lynchburg on June the 17th. Can anybody tell me what's happening at Petersburg on about that same time? That's when Grant's moved his army south of the James River. That's the very day that he starts launching his attacks against Robert E. Lee's troops at Petersburg as they're racing to get into position to save Petersburg. Because if Petersburg falls, all the railroad logistics and supply logistics there means that Richmond would have to be abandoned. So, but Robert E. Lee has sent 10,000 men under the command of Jubal A to save Lynchburg. Now, at the time, Lee only had about 50,000 infantry, so he's sending 20% of his force to save Lynchburg. That tells you how crucial it was to hold Lynchburg. And Jubal A will do it. A couple days before this, General Hunter's chief of staff had written in his diary, he said, "Nothing can stop us now from capturing Lynchburg, save a corps from Robert E. Lee's army." Well, that's exactly what Robert E. Lee sent out there, and he got there in the nick of time. Now, Lee's also going to seize the initiative out here in the Shenandoah Valley. Early's going to get his army up to the strength of about 16,000 to 18,000 men. It's going to be the forces that came from Lee's army, plus the Valley troops that were already out there. And he's going to cross the Potomac River. fight the Battle of Monocacy on July the 9th. 2 days later, he's at the very gates of Washington, D.C. As Captain James Clay, the grandson of Senator Henry Clay, the great compromiser and senator of Kentucky, wrote home to his mother, he says, "We are closer to the Yankee capital than they have ever been to ours." He says, "I can see the dome lurking in the distance." Well, Grant was lucky, and he was able to get reinforcements to Washington, D.C., just in the nick of time to save it, just as Lee had saved Lynchburg from capital. Early will fall back into Loudoun County, Virginia, across the Blue Ridge. He'll fight a successful rearguard action on July the 18th at Snickers Gap, and then he will fall back to Fisher's Hill, just south of Strasburg. When he's there on July 22nd, he's going to get orders from General Robert E. Lee, and the essence of those orders are, if you can hold all these troops that went out to Washington and chased you into the Shenandoah Valley, says, if you can keep them away from Richmond and Petersburg where they'll come back and attack me, says, you can stay in the Shenandoah Valley. Well, the next day, July 23rd, Jubal Early is going to send his cavalry out on a reconnaissance in force, and there'll be some skirmishing down in this area around Kernstown. They will capture a couple of Union officers, and they will learn that the greater part of the troops that were pursuing out of Washington, D.C., that'd be the 6th Corps and the 19th Corps, about 15,000 men under the command of an officer named General Horatio Wright. They're already east of the Blue Ridge and in Fairfax County, marching to cross the Potomac River and get into Washington, D.C. Their objective is to get on the ships and get back down to Petersburg where they can help Grant out. Well, Jubal Early is determined to stop that. And on the morning of July the 24th of 1864, he's going to endeavor to carry out these orders. And that's going to be to take an action in the Shenandoah Valley to prevent the troops from returning to Grant. And that's going to lead us to the Second Battle of Kernstown. Now we'll go out into the battlefield and we'll cover a lot of the details of what happened out there. So I'm going to digress now and go backwards and talk a little bit about some of the key players. The most important personality in this coming engagement is Lieutenant General Jubal Anderson Early. He's a native of Franklin County, Virginia. I don't know if you've been down there and you head south on 220 out of Roanoke. I don't know, there used to be a big billboard, and I don't know if it's there anymore, but it would say, "Welcome to the moonshine capital of the South, Franklin County, Virginia." And Early came from what was described as a very well-to-do and wealthy family for this region. They owned a number of slaves. He was one of 13 children. He had attended West Point and graduated from there. He started to see some action in the Mexican War, and he was sent down there, but he had a bad attack, got sick, and came down with rheumatism that would plague him for the rest of his life. He's also a confirmed bachelor. In the late 1830s, he had met a young woman named Livonia, a beauty from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, down at the resorts down at White Sulphur Springs. And they resolved they were going to meet there again the following year. And they had the date arranged. And about a month or so before that particular date arose, he gets a letter in the mail, and it was a mail clipping from Philadelphia newspaper announcing the marriage of this girl to another man. And so that's the legend, is that why he never married after that. He did father 4 children, though. So he did not completely write off romantic relationships. But Early would start off in the Civil War as a colonel of the 24th Virginia Infantry. This is a unit from Franklin County, Southwest Virginia area, down in that sector of the Commonwealth. He would rise to brigade command, leading 3 regiments in the counterattack across Chin Ridge at the Battle of First Manassas or Bull Run in July of 1861. He would go on and continue as a brigade commander until he's wounded at the Battle of Williamsburg during the McClellan's Peninsula campaign. That'd be in May of 1862. He's gonna miss the battles of the 7 days under Robert E. Lee, but he would return in time to serve under Stonewall Jackson in August of 1862. And he would be given a different brigade. He'd have a large brigade of Virginians in Stonewall Jackson's corps. And when on August 9th at Cedar Mountain, just south of Culpeper, Virginia, this is kind of the opening act of the Second Manassas campaign against General John Pope. Things weren't looking good for Jackson there. Pope's troops under General Banks had launched a hard-hitting attack, and the center of the Confederate line and the left were falling back in confusion. And it would be Jubal Early's troops who would be the ones that would come up and restore order there. It's going to be an interesting thing here is that Jubal Early is going to be in a similar role at Second Manassas, Antietam, and the Battle of Fredericksburg, where he's kind of in a reserve role and things go wrong in the front lines. He'd do this on August 29th at the railroad cut and come up and help restore this line after Union troops had broken through. At Antietam, he would play a key role in helping Stonewall Jackson hold the West Woods there when Union troops seemed as if they were going to overrun it, and helped him organize an impromptu counterattack. By Antietam, I should note, he's been promoted because of men being killed and wounded in the command chain above him. He's now as a division commander. At Fredericksburg, it was A.P. Hill's division on the far southern flank of the battlefield. It's often forgotten about, but people tend to focus on the Irish Brigade and Union troops charging that stone wall. But the Union troops under George Meade actually smashed through Stonewall Jackson's line, and it would be Jubal Early who would spearhead the counterattack that restored the line in that area. He'd continue commanding capably at the Battle of Chancellorsville. He'd come into controversy. You know, there's all the controversy with Gettysburg on July 1st. He was under Dick Ewell, and his troops were tactically very successful. But he gets caught up in that controversy that should the Confederates have pushed on and taken Cemetery Hill on that first day. In the Battle of the Wilderness, Jubal Early's on May the 5th and 6th of 1864. He's going to be a key man in holding lines as Union troops are smashing through. With the illness that overcomes commander of the 3rd Corps, General A.P. Hill, he will lead the 3rd Army Corps capably throughout the Spotsylvania battles for a couple of weeks in the middle and late May of 1864. And when Dick Ewell is unable to continue in command of the 2nd Corps, it will be Jubal Early who is placed in command. And when Robert E. Lee needed somebody capable to turn to send out to Lynchburg, and then these contingency plans for the invasion of Maryland and threatening Washington, D.C., he turned to old Jude. There's probably not another man in the Army that could have done it. Longstreet, a very capable guy, but he had shown himself to not have that ability as an independent commander. You know, Jubal Early, his reputation is tarnished because finally, in late 1864, Grant puts the resources out here, and he has a large army, more than 35,000 men under the command of Phil Sheridan, concentrated against him. Stonewall Jackson had a large number of men against him in 1862, but they were divided up. You know, you had 14,000 men under Fremont over in West Virginia. You had Banks, and you know, they were never together. And you had Shields, and so it was all different. So Early had the misfortune to have to go toe-to-toe against Sheridan. And Early also kind of become overconfident by that point in the war and lost sight of the track that a lot of his success from June, for 3 months, from June until September 19th, was due to maneuver rather than head-on fighting against larger forces. But on July the 24th would be the pinnacle of his campaign from a tactical perspective in 1864. Now on the Union side, his opponents, the official commander was Major General David Hunter. Hunter was very close to Abraham Lincoln. They were both vehement in sharing their abolitionist beliefs, and Hunter, especially during the election, he started a correspondence up with Lincoln, and when Lincoln was elected, he chose Hunter to be one of the men who was going to be on his security detail when he took that train ride from Illinois to Washington, D.C. in March of 1861. Remember, there was no Secret Service, and the threats against Lincoln's life from Southerners were very rampant at the time and very real. So Lincoln had to put together there, and he had to find some officers who could be trusted, and Hunter was one of them. Hunter would capably lead a division at the First Battle of Manassas, although he would be seriously wounded and taken off the field as his troops were successfully overrunning Matthews Hill before they reached the climax on Henry Hill. Hunter would he would have some coastal commands, and he would have a lot of friction with some of the neighboring commanders, and was never able to coordinate campaigns. And at one point, Lincoln advises him basically to calm down, get along with people, that you're choosing the worst, basically says you're choosing the best course if you plan to ruin yourself politically. And so he's ultimately, can't remember if he was resigned or was relieved of command, but he's going to have a resurgence because he's going to be on an inspection tour of Grant's army when Grant heads out to East Tennessee to save Chattanooga from capture after the Battle of Chickamauga. And the two men strike up a friendship and get along. And when Sigel fails in 1864 at the Battle of Newmarket, it's almost right away that the War Department suggests Hunter as the replacement, and Grant jumped at that. Of course, Grant may have actually put the seed of having Hunter in a higher command earlier on in there. Hunter at one point in, it was April or early May, requested command of one of the corps in the Army of the Potomac, so he had been lobbying for it. So he failed at Lynchburg, though. He fails to capture that. Not only did he fail to capture it, but he retreated into the mountains of West Virginia. It took river boats up to the Ohio River. They thought it would be, hey, we'll take river boats, and then we'll get on the railroad, and we'll be back over to Martinsburg and Harper's Ferry in no time. Well, there was a drought, and the river boats were backed up. And then they'd go for a little bit on the river boat, then they'd have to disembark the army around the low spots in the river and wait for more river boats to come from the other side. So it turned into a disaster, and there was nobody there to confront Early when he crossed the Potomac River in early July of 1864. They just had to pull scratch forces together to resist him at the Battle of Montgomery. Hunter, however, because he's kind of falling out of favor with the military establishment, but he's connected politically with Lincoln, he's not removed of command, but he's pretty much told, and this is about mid-July, you establish a headquarters somewhere, Cumberland, Harper's Ferry, wherever you feel it should be, and you let George Crook take command of the army in the field. And George Crook is a West Pointer. He's from Ohio. When the war breaks out, he's out west when the war breaks out. About 6 months into the war, he's going to be brought east and given command of the 36th Ohio Regiment, which he would follow him wherever his command was. They would be transferred. And in 1864, they're out here in the Shenandoah Valley with him. Crook did a good job in early 61 and 62 in West Virginia, fighting mostly against irregulars and guerrilla bands. that had risen up. And he gets his big claim to fame there. He wins the Battle of Louisburg in May of 1862. And there was a very sizable action there. He defeats Henry Heath. And it was supposed to be an effort by the South, kind of to coincide with Stonewall Jackson's efforts in the Shenandoah Valley, but over in the Greenbrier Valley there, to push the Union troops in West Virginia back out of the way. But it fails, and Crook routs them, gaining a name for himself. He'd be brought east to join the Army of the Potomac in that late summer. He would be at the Battle of Antietam, and we would call this not one of his better days. For a guy who was supposed to be known as an Indian fighter who knew his way, kind of a sneak up on him type guy, he gets lost in the woods there and is unable to play an effective role in the fighting at the Burnside Bridge on September 17th. He would go back to the west, and by late 1863 he's commanding a cavalry division in the Army of the Cumberland, very effectively chasing down Joe Wheeler in one of his raids in Tennessee, winning a victory at a large cavalry engagement at the Battle of Farmington, Tennessee. And he was hoping that he was going to stay there, and it was looking like he was going to be one of the lead cavalry commanders in Sherman's Atlanta campaign in 1864. But Grant's going to bring Crook east to take command of a division in the Department of West Virginia. West Virginia's recently become a new state, and it seemed that a lot of the commanders that had been sent there, a la Franz Sigel and some others, were more second-rate. And it was thought they needed to have somebody to bolster the weak leader there. George Crook was somebody who was brought in there. Again, he would be successful in his raid into Southwest Virginia, while Sigel's failing in the Shenandoah Valley. He comes east and joins Hunter. Hunter kind of disregards his advice on the raid for Lynchburg. Crook told him Hunter's complaining about a lack of supplies and ammunition, and Crook says, look, I've got plenty of ammunition. You let my division go immediately, and we're going to go right to Lynchburg. We'll get there, we'll destroy all the railroad and as much as the infrastructure as we can, and then we'll get out there. He tried to convince Hunter that it was as much about speed and timing and getting there rather than amassing a large force, and going there. We want to get it, destroy it, and then get out of there. We're not going to hang on to that thing because we're too close to the Confederate center of gravity. Well, Hunter didn't follow those advice, but he did on the retreat out of there when he realized that he had to rely on Crook to get him out of there through the mountains of West Virginia. Crook would then come east, and he's now the field commander of what's known as the Army of West Virginia. He would, under the command of Horatio Wright, fight at the Battle of Snicker's Gap on July the 18th. He'd come up with a plan where he's trying to flank the Confederates out of their position where Route 7 now crosses the Shenandoah River in Clark County. Unfortunately, the Confederates had outflanked him even farther, and his troops were forced back across the river in confusion. But coming forward now to July 22nd, that's the same date that Jubal A at Fisher's Hill got his instructions and operating guidelines from Robert E. Lee, which, just to remind you, if you want to stay in the valley, you got to make sure all those troops that Grant has in the valley don't get back here and attack me in Richmond. Well, Crook, at the same very date, assesses the situation perfectly accurate. He comes up with an operational plan that he translates back to General Hunter at Department Headquarters in Harper's Ferry, and he tells him, he says, look, and this is after Wright's back. Crook's probably got 12 or 13,000 men. And the thing to keep in mind here is that you can't look at a soldier being equal. Most of Jubal Early's soldiers had been fighting in Bull Run, Manassas, Antietam, Fredericksburg, the Wilderness. Hardcore veteran soldiers know how to fight, know how to maneuver under fire. And they've been successful in almost every engagement they've been. Crook's men, for the most part, have been garrison troops. He's got his own regiment, the 36th Ohio and the 23rd Ohio under Rutherford B. Hayes, which had significant combat experience, but those are only 2 regiments out of probably, a couple dozen regiments in the entire armies. Most of his men do not have the combat experience, so they're going to be outnumbered about 16,000 to 12 or 13,000, and they're also going to be outmanned in terms of combat and military experience. Crook recognizes that and communicates back to Hunter on the 22nd that the enemy's too strong for him and that he needs to wait for Early to detach troops east of the Blue Ridge before they can take the offensive. One of the things that Crook is relaying this information back to Hunter is because Grant has given instructions, hey, go after the enemy, put yourself south of the enemy, push up, and he wants to go back to Stanton, go back to the original game plan. So Crook's trying to get the message through as to what the actual situation is. Now, there's going to also be cavalry engagements on the 22nd, the 23rd, and in all of these engagements, the cavalry are reporting back to Crook, the enemy's here in force. Even before, the day before, on the 21st of July, William Averill, one of the cavalry commanders, is engaging. He moves as far south as down around Middletown, Cedar Creek area, and he engages some of the pickets from the Confederate infantry down there. So there's no indication that Early has left. But at some point between the 22nd and the 24th, morning of the 24th, George Crook becomes convinced that the Confederates are no longer in that strength. When he starts operating tactically here on the 24th, he's completely changed his mindset. We don't know why. My hypothesis on that is Crook did not trust his cavalry commanders, General Duffier and General Averill, much at all, and he had a very low opinion of them. And Crook later alluded to the fact, well, they kept reporting that the enemy was coming in force for 2 days previous, and then they never showed up. So he started just kind of disregarding the warnings, and he's going to pay the price for that out here on the battlefield, as you will soon see. Do any of you have any questions on anything in the battlefield, like characters here? 2 other people I want to talk about briefly here. And one is Colonel James Mulligan. He's going to be front and center of the infantry combat for the Union here for most of the day on July the 24th. Mulligan was born in Utica, New York, the son of Irish immigrants. His father would die, his mother would remarry, and they'd be moved to Chicago, Illinois. He was born in 1830, and he recalled there were still Indians you'd see coming into town every now and then. And he recalled growing up there as the halcyon days of hoeing corn, sparking the girls on the shores of Lake Michigan, and just very, not what you'd think of growing up in Chicago today. It was a very early in its existence there. And he grows up as a devout Roman Catholic, becomes a lawyer in Chicago, very well connected in Chicago Democratic politics. At one point he was down in Central America. He was kind of a clerk on a mission where they were, some of the preliminary expeditions about where could a canal be built across Central America. I think they were actually in Nicaragua on the expedition that he was with. He would go to Washington, D.C. for a couple of years in the late 1850s and served as a clerk in one of the departments. And, he basically, his comment in his journal was, "I've seen enough of this place." And he goes back to Chicago. He marries a beautiful young Marion Nugent. They would have 1 daughter before the war. 2 more would be born during the course of the war. His wife, while he's out here in the Shenandoah Valley in 1864, is pregnant with the third daughter, and she's in Cumberland, Maryland. She always tried to be as near to him as was safely possible during the war. But Mulligan's combat experience, his biggest combat experience is in 1861. He's at Lexington, Missouri with about 3,000 Union troops. He's got his own regiment, the 23rd Illinois, which was known as Mulligan's Irish Brigade, mostly from Chicago, but it had some Wisconsin men, Michigan companies as well. And he's the senior officer in command, and they put up a bold front for about a week or so as the Confederate force of about 10,000 men is surrounding them. He's kind of a very flamboyant type of speaker, and when I think it was Sterling Price sent in a flag of truce asking Mulligan if he hoped to surrender, if he would like to surrender, discuss terms of surrender, and Mulligan's reply was simply, "Yes, I accept your surrender." Ultimately, Mulligan ended up being the one to surrender to Price, as it was a no-win situation. And then there's some terms of the exchange there. The men were allowed to go back to Chicago, but it took a long time for their paroles and exchanges to be formalized, and so he's not going to get back into active military operations until the late summer of 1862. And they're actually on a train, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and this is right in the midst of the Antietam campaign. And somewhere the rumor started that Mulligan's Irish Brigade is going to the Army of the Potomac, and they're going to join General Thomas Francis Meagher and the famed Irish Brigade of the Army of the Potomac. Well, they got let off the train somewhere in West Virginia and would spend basically the next 18 months guarding the railroad and fighting rebel raiders and guerrillas until the spring of 1864. Even then, Mulligan and his men were on their veteran furlough when the campaign started in May. They were in Chicago. So he doesn't join the active fighting until Early is retreating from Maryland. And then he would be at Snicker's Gap, and then Kernstown's going to be his big claim to fame. He doesn't have a lot of military combat experience, in truth. He demanded that as the senior colonel, and by senior colonel I mean there was 3 colonels there. 2 of them, Colonel Joseph Thoburn, had been commanding brigades and divisions for 2 years. The other, Colonel Isaac Duval, had a brigade and a division throughout the campaign. Crook and the men under them had a lot of confidence in them. They'd been through a lot, through success and failure in the spring of 1864. So Crook didn't want to make the change. So ultimately, when Mulligan pressed his case, says, "Hey, I'm the senior colonel. I should have the largest division." Well, what Crook ends up doing is he takes the brigade of troops that Mulligan had brought with him and calls out a couple other regiments into another new brigade, and Mulligan's going to have about 1,800 men here. Mulligan had initially liked George Crook. Before that, he had been fighting under Sigel and under Alfred Duffier, a German and a Frenchman. And he said it was rather nice to serve under a general who had some common sense and also understood how to speak the English language. A couple days later, he's not so happy with him after that, and pretty sure that it's this whole division thing where Mulligan thought he should have the largest division. And Crook went with the men that were experienced and had confidence for him. Well, Mulligan didn't see that way. He wrote in his journal, "I'm taking the measure of General Crook. His name says it." Pretty sure he's referring to, he had been robbed of what he felt. And technically under military law, that was the proper thing, but Crook was looking at it from an experience and confidence factor. Colonel Thoburn, the man who did have the largest division, later wrote that Mulligan was perhaps more popular outside of the Army than Innis. One of the reasons for that was his association with Stephen Douglas, and then after the Civil War broke out, he rallied a lot of the Irish to the Union cause, and when he was waiting to be exchanged so he could return to the Army, he did like a tour of all the major northern cities promoting the Union cause in 1862 to rally more Irish to the cause. So that's going to stop there with everything. I think we've got a good background on the major players here, and we'll head out to the field.
For those of you that have mobility issues, we do have golf carts. So the students sitting out there, if you need a ride,